Welcome to the podcast for 1776 Forward.
We're the grassroots movement that's crowdsourcing activism for the cause of philosophical liberalism.
Stand up.
Speak out.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast for 1776 Forward. I'm Joia, and today I'm really excited that Ash Ryan is here on the call with me, and we're doing a follow-up on a video that I hope you might have seen, a video I did before with Adam and Chris that I at least love to call the Altruism Grudge Match. And in that video, I was taking a position of presenting problems that I see with Ayn Rand's presentation of altruism, specifically her definition of sacrifice, which, as I presented in that video, that I think is just empirically and factually wrong. And it sets up a binary of egoism versus altruism that, to my thinking, just doesn't match reality and doesn't match what human beings actually need to survive and thrive. But it's also my belief that as human beings, we're not just here to identify problems and sit around and whine, that the whole purpose of identifying a problem is to work on solving the problem. So I'm hoping that that's what we can start to do here today. And really, I see this as just what is the first of hopefully a series of conversations that even you in the audience can come and be a part of, to do what I consider really solving this ethical problem of what ought to be the proper relationship between the individual to the society. And we've talked in 1776 Forward, it's in our manifesto. I talk about having the values of both autonomy and community. That's one framework I have for thinking about how we want to integrate both of these values into our lives. But I'm really happy that Ash is here to help talk through these ideas with me. Some of you might have seen that Ash posted a really long series of comments on the original YouTube video. And if you haven't seen Ash's comments, it's practically like an essay. It was so remarkable what he wrote. So I'm glad that he's here, that we can just talk through some of the ideas that he expressed in those comments, and then maybe we could use that to start building off of things. And Ash, I'm really glad you're here, because you were the person who told me once that you thought that an even better definition of human beings is the problem-solving animal, as opposed to just the rational animal. And that's something, the more I think about it, I think is 100% correct. So we'll start with problem-solving animal.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks for having me on, Joia. I'm looking forward to it. So I just want to say too about my comments on the Altruism Grudge Match video. So we had talked before, you and I, just about this issue of altruism versus egoism and sacrifice, and some of the maybe criticisms or that you had about that. And I agree with you that I think that, egoism and altruism is probably not the best model or framework to approach these issues with anymore. So yeah, and then, so when you released that Altruism Grudge Match video, you sent me the link and asked me for my thoughts on it. So I just posted those comments on YouTube. I don't know if I would describe them as an essay, because they definitely don't have that much structure to them. It was just kind of like my off the cuff thoughts off the top of my head, but yeah, they were longer than I had intended. So hopefully that gives us some material to kind of go over and discuss this issue a little bit further today. So you said you wanted to start out with talking about human beings as the problem-solving species.
Yeah, maybe if you just even, you were the one who suggested that to me once, and maybe we could even start there. And I will even say, even from my background as an English teacher, and in defense of the essay, that essay, we learned, really even just does mean to try. So I even think that it's the later stages of an essay when you really put forward the structured and well edited, crafted argument, but that a first essay really is just a try at getting some important ideas out and putting them out on paper as a way to start thinking through them. And to me, this was a perfect example of what you did there, that it seemed that you just had this response. You came up with these comments too, like really quickly. It just seemed like you must have been in the zone and it just flew out of you. So, but it's a great opportunity, I think, to just have something out there. And now we can start taking these ideas and seeing if they can be seeds that can lead to something else. But yeah, you can pick up with problem solving, or if you wanted to just dive right into some of your thoughts about the relationship of the individual to society. I love how you talk about the spiral relationship of the individual to society. That was something that came out in what you wrote there.
Yeah, well, that previous video, I think, gave me a lot of material to think about. So that was why I was able to write so much about it. So if anybody hasn't watched that one yet, probably go back and watch that one first. But yeah, I definitely, the way I tend to approach all these kind of issues where people set up this sort of binary framework of looking at something is that usually there's some truth about on both sides. Because usually it's not that, unless they really are, like mutually contradictory positions, usually they're just kind of like opposite ends of a pole that like form a spectrum. And I try to take a perspective that integrates a whole range of that perspective, of that spectrum. So and that's kind of where that spiral comes in, because I think what usually happens is there's sort of like a top down and a bottom up way of looking at it. And I think that is particularly useful maybe with regard to this discussion, because what we're really talking about here is the relationship of the individual to society, and in a sense, you can look at it from either perspective, and people do tend to look at it from one perspective or the other and say, well, either the individual is the primary thing and society is just this abstraction, but really it's just a kind of loose conglomeration of individuals, and when they say society is an abstraction, what they mean by that is it isn't real. Like there's no such thing as society really. It's just a term we use to talk about a collection of individuals. And on the other hand, there's people who talk about society in this very reified way of like that's like the real primary reality, and the individual is just like a part of as what's the word I'm looking for? It's like a cog in the machine of society or something like that, right? And like a dispensable cog at that, like one that, is just replaceable by any other person, that, like the individual really doesn't matter. And I think both of those views are partly right and partly wrong, and wrong in the sense of just incomplete because they're not recognizing the truth to the other aspect. And so I don't know if that's a kind of a good place to jump in, if you have kind of any follow-ups on that.
It's funny because as you outline your common practice here of trying to integrate both aspects, it's really funny. Chris Bush and I talk about, we have this joke that if we ever formally organize this whole project and form some kind of company or organization out of it, that we have to call it both and enterprises, because
Yes.
that has been the rule of thumb that has animated so much of our thinking, precisely to what you were saying, that perhaps there are a few examples where there is some real polarity. Like I suppose the classic one is health, right? Like health versus poison. But even there, it's really health versus non-health, because there are even situations where actual poison can be healthy for you. I always think of the Count of Monte Cristo example. That's always, to me, especially being the literature person, the signature example where that, when you live in a 19th century novel and there is a possibility that someone could be out to poison you, you want to take poison on a daily basis so that you build up your tolerance. That is the healthy choice. But I guess the health versus non-health would be almost an Aristotelian A versus non-A kind of example of a polarity, where clearly we want health and we want to completely dismiss anything that's non-health. But most of the things in life that we encounter there really are two values. And what I see is that it seems that society, we often, almost like a pendulum, swing between each of them, where one of them really gets a whole lot of emphasis. And then we kind of realize like, oh, like, well, maybe we weren't paying enough attention to this one. So then we swing back, and often perhaps we swing back more than we ought to. And not necessarily that what we're looking for is something precisely in the middle. You and I have had conversations before about why I don't necessarily like the term balance, precisely because it implies scales with equal parts on both sides. And so I don't think that's what we're talking about here. It's not that we need 50% individualism and 50% society, but there is a real way in which both the individual is valuable and society is valuable, or as I like to talk about it, autonomy is a value and community is a value. And we do, I think, need a way to think about how do we integrate these values. And I love what you're talking here about the spiral approach of thinking of coming at it from both a bottom up and a top down perspective. So did you even want to say some more about that idea?
Well, just to comment on what you just said about the pendulum thing, and that there's not necessarily like a sweet spot in the middle that's just like a set spot that we want to always be at. I think there are these, feedback mechanisms sort of built into any complex adaptive system like this that, where I think it's actually healthy that we're kind of swinging back and forth, and maybe, hopefully we're zeroing in around whatever the optimum would be at any given time, but that's, always going to be a moving target and changing. So, there's always going to be that, continual, like adjustment towards that. So so I think just, you don't want to think of it in terms of like some sort of like static ideal that you're aiming for, because the whole point of society is this very complex adapting thing. And, and a lot of these things, like even, like you're talking about health versus non-health or whatever, but, like health is sort of contextual. Like you said, if you're living in a 19th century novel, like maybe you want to be consuming more arsenic than you otherwise would. But even there, like, a poison, what constitutes a poison is largely dose dependent. So all of these things are kind of relative, and you always want to be, kind of keeping that in mind. But yeah, as far as the relationship of the individual to society and the values of autonomy and community that you talked about, I think it's interesting because that spiral, it seems like in some ways we do swing back and forth between those, but it seems like we are actually growing in our appreciation and recognizing, like from a historical perspective, looking at this in historical timescales, we're actually growing in our perspective, maybe of both of those sides. We're actually increasing our range of recognizing the value of both ends of that spectrum. Because certainly, like it's more obvious that, well, like the individual and the value of the individual and the sovereignty of the individual has been, kind of increasingly recognized from the time of, the beginning of recorded history through the Renaissance and then, to the Enlightenment era and the founding of the United States. And then you could say, well, maybe that's waned a little bit since then, which is kind of the point of your project here. But, like in some ways, it seems like the value of community and society is also kind of recognized to a greater level than it was in the past as well. I think people are just, like I said earlier, that people tend to look at these from one perspective or the other, but, at any given moment they might do that. But I do think actually people in general have kind of an increasing awareness of both sides of this. And, and I think, in the last few decades, you've seen that with just the increasing awareness of, that it's almost taken for granted. Like if you put it in these terms, that people would generally agree, like, well, of course the goal isn't to like make the individual subservient to society or vice versa, but for people to have these mutually beneficial win-win kind of relationships. And so I think that's the goal that we're looking for. And that is kind of the simplest way to put, the ideal that we're trying to capture here. So I think, sorry, there was a way that you put it in some of our other conversations that I think really captures that as well. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought, but I don't know if you want to pick up there.
Yeah, well, I'll just pick up on some of the things that you're saying that I would love to comment on. So first, I think you're absolutely right. This idea of the dynamism of this, that there is no one static sweet spot, that for any given individual, some people are more introverted, some people are more extroverted. So while we can say that autonomy and community are values for any individual, that different individuals will have different ways of integrating this that will be different. And then it can be different over the course of your lifetime. There's certain times, for example, I know there have been times in my own life where sometimes I just need to be by myself. There's something that I'm really struggling with, and just having too much feedback from other people, I just need to be by myself, process things in my own mind. And then there's other moments in my life when it's the exact opposite of that, when I really need support from other people and feedback from other people. So it's not as though there's ever one perfect platonic static sweet spot that would be the same for all people or for one person at all times. And I think that there's probably a really interesting way to connect this even into evolution and the way that we need to adapt, because circumstances are changing, and then as creators we're affecting that environment. And so we need to have a model that allows us to think about these values in a way that can respond to the ways that the conditions surrounding us are continuously changing, so that we can adapt with these values and figure out what is sort of the optimum balance at any moment in time. So that was one thing I wanted to say about the dynamism. And then I definitely wanted to pick up on this idea of building the mutually win-win relationships, because to me, that's a huge part of thinking about this model. So if anybody's seen any of our other videos, you've probably heard me talk about, I have this mental model that I talk about of the creator trader versus the predator prey way of interacting with society. And just really briefly, predator prey, this is the scarcity mindset approach to how we think about relationships and how we deal with resources. So it's scarcity in terms of the idea that we have limited resources that we're fighting over, and that some people are going to win and some people are going to lose, and that the way to survive is to be a predator and to prey on others. And to your point about, I think, how we've advanced on the historical timescale, that what we've come to recognize is that overall, individual human beings and humanity as a species, we thrive best when we say that this predator-prey approach to relationships and the world is morally wrong, and we make it illegal, and we shun people who don't do that, and we embrace instead the creator-trader approach to relationships. And this is the abundance model. It's what recognizes that, to tie this back to human beings, we are the problem-solving animal, that is how we survive and thrive, is by creating solutions, ever greater and greater solutions to the problems that are there. That's been what I see as the history and the forward trajectory of progress. We come up with a new innovation. It's the 1.0. A lot of times an innovation will bring problems with it, and then we have to solve for those problems. And then, we get the 2.0 version and the 3.0 version, where we're just continuously iterating on solving problems. That's the creator aspect. And then trading with others, building these win-win relationships where we're able to specialize in our own aspects of problem solving, and then voluntarily agree to trade amongst each other. And this gets into something that I know you've talked to me a lot about, thinking about how society is complex, and that it's difficult, it's impossible really to have just one person doesn't have the omniscience to know and plan what would be best for all individuals, that there's something valuable about what emerges from a bunch of individuals coming up with their own mutually beneficial win-win relationships, and what emerges from that model of freedom and the free market that we see when human beings start with this let's build win-win relationship trader approach to relating to each other.
Yeah, definitely. And I was rereading my comments on the Altruism Grudge Match before we started, and I my main takeaway from my own earlier comments was that it's not just, because a lot of people, obviously it seems like that just goes without saying almost, it's so obvious that other people are a potential value to us, but that is such an understatement. And it's not just that other people are a potential value to us, it's that they are the greatest potential value to us. And it's precisely because of that complexity that comes from living in a society of individuals that can specialize and exchange with each other, that we can create such higher levels of value that benefit all of us than we could just working by ourselves, either on a desert island, or even just like in tandem with other people, or in parallel with other people, but without like interacting in these sort of complex ways. So, and yeah, I just sorry, I lost my train of thought again. My brain is getting a little bit slow, but
No worries. Well, I'll pick up on something you said there, that it's perhaps interesting how we think about competition and cooperation, because competition is clearly a value, but the way I see it anyway is that competition is a value within this broader system that focuses on, I guess, what you could call more cooperation, but at least this creator trader framework. And then within the creator trader framework, we want McDonald's competing with Burger King and Coke competing with Pepsi to see who can produce the product that will appeal to different people, and try to find the best way to utilize resources, and and I mean, the model obviously also makes it possible to develop all sorts of little niche markets as well, and that's part of the abundance that gets created. But that it's significant that the competition of Coke versus Pepsi is not the competition of, let's say, two nations warring against each other, where one is just going to wipe out and slaughter the other. It's a competition of problem solving within this wider framework that values trade and that is respecting individual rights. I don't know what you think about that, or if you have any thoughts about how that.
Well, I can't remember where exactly, but I once heard capitalism defined as the economic system in which people compete over who gets to collaborate with each other. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was really interesting, because really, like, the essence of a free market is individuals coming together to form these win-win relationships. So competition is almost kind of like a byproduct. That's not really the point. That's just, it's just one aspect of what's going on that you can kind of separate out for analysis. But really the core of it, the essence, is people coming together to form these win-win relationships, and specializing and exchanging, and thereby being able to create more value. And I think we've seen, like, over the past couple of decades, since 1776, which was not only the year that the United States was declared its independence, but also that was the year of the publication of Adam Smith's On the Wealth of Nations. Mm-hmm. And as we've seen the spread of capitalism around the globe as sort of the dominant economic system, the gains in human well-being that have just sort of followed in lockstep just kind of speak for themselves now. And like the data on that is just kind of incredible. Like if you go to, ourworldanddata.com and you can look at, like in that past couple of centuries, the average person's lifespan has more than doubled, and people's access to education and healthcare and all of these goods has just increased exponentially, and it just seems pretty clear that that is a result of people being left free to have these kind of collaborative interactions with each other, because like the local exceptions to that general trend of progress have all been in places that have explicitly renounced that kind of economic freedom, like with the Soviet red lines and things like that. So
you reminded me too of something else I wanted to pick up on something else you said, that even tying this idea of freedom into this idea that we are, you put it one way to me in a conversation, I don't remember exactly, but I want to say you described it as we're somehow like the super social being. Is that what you would say? That even more than perhaps like other animals we see that are social beings, that human beings were like social to the max. Like, am I saying this correctly? How would you want to say that?
I don't remember exactly how I put it before. I don't remember that specific conversation, but I would agree with that for sure. Like, because I think, when you look at it from an evolutionary or a historical perspective, we just exhibit as a species, we exhibit a much higher level of social interaction and cooperation than any other animal. And I think that is just kind of a corollary of our conceptual level of consciousness, that we can think in general principles, and we are this problem-solving species. So I think that just is kind of goes along with that. So I definitely, and that goes back to what I was saying before about, it's not just that other people are a potential value to us, it's they're the greatest potential value to us. And we've talked before about, the goal isn't to live, on some desert island where you might be perfectly free, but that would not be a human existence. That would, even we've talked about, like in literature, where there have been examples of this, where they kind of like take the individual out of society, like Robinson Crusoe, or the Tom Hanks movie Castaway you brought up one time. Their goal is always to rejoin society. It's not, it's, and it, in a way, or even like something more recent, like say The Martian, the novel or the movie about the astronaut who gets stranded on Mars. And so all of these, are kind of highlighting the individual heroism of the person who is able to survive and, meet his basic survival needs on his own in that kind of isolation without being part of society. But like nobody would call that the sort of flourishing life that they would aim for, right?
I think you're absolutely right. And those, even in those examples, they show us how desperately human beings need other human beings. I just always think of Castaway, where Wilson, he has to create a beach ball that is another human being, precisely because we're built to need human connection. Even at that deep emotional, spiritual level, let alone everything else. To me, and I think this ties even to the point you were making before, where as we're looking over the historical time scale, we see that perhaps we've been recognizing the value of both individualism and society, both of these. So to me, it's always been interesting, one, that so to start with society, that clearly we are social beings to start with, just the basic biology of you need two individuals, a male and a female, a sperm and an egg, to come together to create a new individual. And then the fascinating thing to me about human beings is that we're not like baby reptiles, where we come out of their egg or our womb, and we're just like, little mini snakes that can just, act like a full grown adult snake. That as mammals, we go through this long maturation process. And for human beings, it's longer than any of the other mammals. And we need other parents or, caregivers to take care of us just to fully reach maturation. And it's always fascinating to me that even in our ability to be individuals. So I know when you and I talk about individualism, and you were just mentioning how the significance of being of the individual mind and of being a conceptual being. And it's interesting to me that what data shows us, I mean, I don't think anybody knows now exactly how language first emerged, but even as we look at examples of specific human beings, we see that if you are not born into a community where you are exposed to language, you don't develop language. You don't actually become a fully functional conceptual being with that ability to attain what you might call optimum individuality, unless you are born into a society that gives you essentially a language, which to me is fascinating of how I think, and perhaps even already starts to show some of this spiral of how the society and the individual come together. But then, as you were pointing out, so we need all of these social structures that then allow us to become individuals who are able to think, to problem solve. And then the best thing we can do with that is to work with others to take those ideas, to take our individual thinking and problem solving and decision making and start to build and create things that ultimately help society as a whole and humanity as a whole starts to progress. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Oh, no, I love that. That's a really great example. Yeah, and I totally agree about how, it really is only in the context of society that we can fully live up to our potential and as individuals, and that it really, because it's like even all of the knowledge and things that we have that we rely on to then differentiate ourselves and contribute something that maybe only we can, that all rests on all of these other individual contributions that have come from all of the other people that have, in our society that have come before, so it really is like there is this complex interaction and this spiral that it's like, that really the interests, and I think this is something that I actually wrote in my original comments on the other videos, the interests of the individual, both largely comprise and are comprised by the interests of the groups to which they belong, and vice versa. The group's interests are comprised of all the individuals that make it up. So you really can't separate it out. It's just by the nature of our species, like you were saying, it's just, we really are this social solitary species, to use the term that I think you got from Bronowski, that I love.
It is one of my favorite phrases from Jacob Bronowski, the ascent of man, that I'm quoting all the time. To my mind, it is the start, I think, of how, to me, that's the seed of how I think we're going to start to build what I think is a better approach to ethics. And certainly I think, Ayn Rand has observations that are valuable about the value of the individual that we want to incorporate into this. But I think we're definitely at a point where we want to go beyond that and kind of incorporate this more holistic framework that thinks about how we are the social solitary and brings in our evolutionary heritage and what we know about our biological development, with these ideas of integrating the individual and the group. So maybe we can switch gears a little bit and tie this back to specifically the topic of altruism. And this was something that came up recently that I already thought was interesting and maybe will help to clarify some certain points about what I have to say about altruism. So I heard a podcast recently with a prominent atheist who at one point in the conversation casually commented as though it were obvious and just a given that, of course, as you might have put it, that we have a moral obligation to help the needy. And when he said that we have a moral obligation to help the needy, it was immediately interesting to me because personally, I would disagree with that statement. I don't think that we have a moral obligation to help the needy. But I do think that it is morally good to be empathetic, to be compassionate, to be concerned about other people's suffering, and to help those who are in need. And I think a lot of people would even see those as somewhat synonymous. So I thought maybe you and I could even start to disentangle what really is the distinction between these two ideas. And hopefully it gets us toward what I would hope would be the better moral position that recognizes that there is value in compassion, in empathy, in care, but that this is something that is distinct from quote unquote altruism, or even this idea of the moral obligation to help the needy. Did you have any thoughts about that to get us started?
Well, it's interesting because I think a lot of people would look at that as being the same, because in practice it's like, well, if you have an obligation to help the needy and you say, well, I don't feel like I should be obligated to, but I think it's morally good to do that. Well, in what sense is it morally good if you're not obligated, or what's the difference there? And I have a similar reaction to you that if somebody says you're obligated to help anyone else who is in need, that you are maybe in a position to help in some way, my immediate reaction is like, well, obligated, by, what does that mean exactly? I mean, couldn't I argue by the same token that everybody else owes me something? Like, to me, there's like this sense of entitlement about that I kind of don't like. So I think maybe the distinction that we're getting at here has to do with motivation, because it's like, are we talking about obligation that comes, like from society, or are we talking about like being motivated because you actually see the value in somebody, and it's not just that you have like this unchosen duty to fulfill, whether you want to or not, or whether it's in your own interest or not, or whether you see the value in the other person or not. Like, that doesn't matter. It's just you're supposed to help other people, kind of, period. And I don't know, like, to me, it just seems like that almost cheapens the actual value in the role that we can play in doing good for other people. It's like, if you're just doing it because you're supposed to or you have to, rather than because you want to, because you actually see them as another human being who is morally worthy of your consideration. And I don't know if that answers your question.
There's a lot there that I would agree with, especially this idea of how the way I would phrase it is that it cheapens the sense of generosity, which I think is a virtue that we would want to cultivate. But one of the ways I even see this, like you brought up even the concept of duty. And this is one essay that I think Ayn Rand is actually spot on about. One of my favorite essays of hers. She has one it's about causality versus duty. And it was interesting to me that when I heard this phrase about the moral obligation to help the needy, that it came from someone who was an atheist, because I think this is a phrase that you might expect to hear from a more religious person, where the duty would just come from God, or it was in the sacred books, and that's why it's there. But I think the question to ask would be, well, what is this obligation? Where would an obligation come from? Where would a duty come from? And in Ayn Rand's essay, she makes this great point that to kind of dismiss the idea of duty and to focus instead on causality. That if there are things that we want to achieve or see affected in the world, that we have to focus on what are the causes. And she kind of puts it that there's a lot of ifs, that if we want to survive and thrive as human beings, that there are things that we then ought to do because it's in the nature of how reality works and how human beings work, that with this if, that we can then focus on the cause that would get us the effect. But then this then perhaps takes us into this question of then, well, what is the value of seeing other people as a value? And so I would say that we don't have this moral obligation. I don't think that there's a higher being that somehow puts this duty onto us. But I would say precisely because of what you and I have already been discussing about the nature of human beings and how we are these social, solitary creatures who do thrive when we create these kinds of really abundant relationships with other people, and that we are perhaps super social, and that we don't even come close to reaching our potential of thriving without really rich relationships, rich network of relationships with others who are creators and traders. That if we start from that perspective, then we can start to see why perhaps compassion and empathy with others starts to make sense and become a value. So even just the fact that if we know from ourselves what it is to suffer, that then we can see someone else's suffering and feel that empathy. And because we are problem solvers, that we would want to have a compassion that would want to help people rise above that suffering that they are experiencing. And to your point about how if there were some kind of obligation, that it cheapens the sense of how we would help. Like the first thing that pops to my mind is when you think about like the gifts you like have to buy for people, and my impression too is those are always like the worst kinds of gifts to receive. The gifts that you get because that like so I was just thinking like when I was a teacher, and sometimes the kids, their parents would tell them you have to give a gift to the teacher, and so all the students give you a gift because they have to, versus the kind of gift that comes because someone really does appreciate you, value you, love you, because they want to give you something in token of the good that they see in you. Those are the kinds of almost magical relationships that we want to have with other people. We want to be the kind of person that creates those kinds of relationships with others, I would say. And that's the vision of human relationships that I think we want to put forward and start to build. Not the kind of view of relationships that sees things in terms of, well, you have this obligation and duty that you're just supposed to do.
Right. Yeah. And, the Ayn Rand point that you mentioned about, not having obligations that are just based on duty, but, recognizing causality in the sense of that if you want to achieve certain values, that you have to do that based on the recognition of certain facts. And I think, the primary fact that we're talking about here, to go back to the previous part of our conversation, is just how other people are potentially the greatest value in our lives. And that doesn't mean that you have this, kind of obligation to go around just helping people sort of indiscriminately in any kind of circumstances whenever you can, like without, regardless of what effect that might have on your other values in your life, and kind of ignoring that context. And it doesn't mean that, like your primary goal in life should be to go around helping other people and finding, ways of exercising the virtue of charity or something like that. And it's not that, charity isn't or can't be a good thing. But I think of charity as sort of like secondary, because it's generally about distributing wealth that's already been created. But the greatest value that we can be to other people is creating this society of kind of abundance that you talked about. And it's like, it reminds me of this saying that Peter Diamandis has that he always likes to say is, if you want to become a billionaire, make $1 billion, help 1 billion people, like solve a problem that 1 billion other people have and figure out a way to economically scale it, which is, like what people who have become billionaires like Bill Gates or somebody have done, like by creating like an operating system like Windows or something. And then he can retire from Microsoft and go start the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and like try to solve health problems for people in poorer parts of the world and things like that. And that's great. That's, if that is how he thinks he can get the greatest value out of his life right now, that's fantastic. But, like, I think the greatest value that he's done was in creating this amazing software company and creating this whole software industry that, actually now enables a lot of people to be able to do the other kind of charitable work that they do. So, so I think that's important to keep in mind is like, it's to help other people doesn't necessarily mean just like going around seeking out people in need that you can just bestow your generosity onto. Like, and sometimes it's just, what do I have of value to that, that would be of other value to other people that I can kind of contribute to the market economy, like, because, like there are lots of charitable organizations that, can provide, cheap clothing or food to people who are in need of that. But, somebody had to actually come up with ways to produce all of that food and clothing to begin with, and in this kind of abundance that then it makes it possible for other people to make that available to other people, very affordably, that because, like previously that just wouldn't have existed. And most people just lived in abject poverty compared to what we have now,
I love that quote from Peter Diamandis. And I agree 100% with what you're talking about focusing on the creation aspect first. But I would recognize too that in the society we've built, that is a society of abundance, there is a role for thinking about distribution. And to my mind, I think that we would want a society with a really robust network of different nonprofit, socially purposed organizations. So one of the things that I've often said is one of the ways I feel that I've always agreed with many people on the left is that I absolutely do believe morally that we ought to have a very strong social safety net to help people in society. But where I find I really disagree with a lot of people on the left is that I see that a lot of people on the left just automatically assume that that social safety net is provided by the government, which means it's provided by force, which then just totally, ties into your point about sort of obligation and cheapening generosity. And, and obviously, what I've talked about with, the creator trader versus the predator prey model. This is the whole point that we want to get rid of force from human relationships. But we want, I think we morally do want people to be generous and to think about how to create, what would be the equivalent of a social safety net. But I would agree with you that perhaps one of the first things you would think about in how you build that net is how do you think about creating abundance. To me, that's almost like if we're going to take this analogy, that's like the rope that forms the actual net. And then we would want to layer on top of that, perhaps thinking about, okay, once we have all of these goods, then maybe we can think about, okay, what are ways that we can think about distributing the different goods to different people. Yeah. And then I just even want to tie this back to some of what we were saying before about even putting this in the evolutionary perspective of the way I see it, that generosity is good because care is part of our nature as mammals. It's how we thrive. But if you even take it back to think about, thousands and thousands of years ago, the first human beings living in their small tribes, and you would think about, who are the needy in that situation. So the needy are certainly the young that we want to care for, to help them become mature, capable, flourishing, independent adults. The needy would be the old, who I think we would care for, in my sense of that, we would care for them in honor of them, precisely because the old had raised us. And then, when they get to a point where they become weak and then need care, we care for them in honor of what it was that they made possible for us. And then I think we, in that society too, there would be the people who would be sick, or who would have, come upon accidents. And we would want to care for those people because of a sense of solidarity and empathy. If we know from ourselves what it is to be sick, or what it is to have an accident happen to us, that that we would rely on other people's generosity, and that then when we were in the position to offer generosity, that this helps. But one of the interesting things even about this scenario to me is that it also recognizes that resilience and strength are important. And to tie this back to something you said before about why you even hated the concept of obligation, because it was presumed a kind of entitlement. And to me, that's a very important point to make, that when we, I think, are helping the needy in a good sense, it's to help them to become strong, or in recognition of their strength. If it's an older person, we precisely want to help them to be not needy. Part of how we want to help them is with the tools of resilience that help them to become strong again, to the extent that that's possible. And that we want to include the value of strength in this vision of care and compassion. And it's certainly a problem I think we see in current society, where, as you were pointing out, that you wouldn't want someone who just kind of makes their life to be about going out and finding people in need. That's the precisely wrong way to think about this issue, that the value is being strong and healthy and capable and and independent. And that's the standard. And we don't want a society where people are just lazy and feel entitled and just live in a state of neediness. So that, and again, I think this is kind of combining two values. We want to combine the value of compassion with the value of strength and resilience. And I think as we're even thinking about how we would put together a better morality, let's say, or a better ethical framework, that we would think about integrating these values of compassion for neediness with the value of strength and resilience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I completely agree with you that we want to live in the kind of society where people want to help those who are less fortunate than themselves, through no fault of their own, or just through the course of nature, like, the elderly or something. Although, and a lot of times, even though, they may be physically not as capable as when they were younger, like a lot of times, the elderly may still have a lot of value to offer. But even, just in honor of their contributions, and because, like, none of us would be here if it weren't for the older generation that came before us. And, but yeah, like, you want to do that in a way that doesn't sort of instill this sense of perpetual victimhood, that people are just, like, our fate is just to constantly be needy and in need of help from other people or the state, or, like some paternalistic government or something. And I think there is sort of the danger of having that safety net be, organized, too much from the top down, of there being like a sort of moral hazard, or like almost like the problem of the commons or something, where it's like, well, if we just say, the government should be responsible for meeting everybody's basic needs, then as individuals, it's like, we don't have as much incentive beyond that to, like, we don't have to care about that anymore, because, like, somebody else is handling that, right? So I think it's good for there to be organizations, like you said, that, nonprofit and charitable organizations and things that do try to solve these kinds of problems for needier people. But I also think it's, important to want to contribute at an individual level, whether that's, through contributing, voluntarily contributing to organizations like that, or just helping people, in your local community, or like if you do pursue a more more of the path I was talking about before, like the Peter Diamandis thing, like help a billion people by or become a billionaire by helping a billion people. It's like, but then once you have created that abundant value, then finding ways to be able to help distribute that value to more people who maybe wouldn't necessarily be able to do it just through their own effort because of whatever their circumstances are in life at the time or something like that. So, yeah.
You're reminding me, one of the things I've also heard Peter Diamandis say when he talks about his optimism for the abundant futures that we're living into, he often puts it in terms of he'll talk about how, we're bringing the internet so that, pretty soon every human being will be connected through the internet. And he'll phrase this in terms of that will be all of these other minds who are here to contribute, to be problem solvers. And maybe this just takes us full circle back to where we started with this value of being a problem solver. In my mind, that to this idea that that's what a human being is, perhaps what a human being adult is, but even children, that this is what is special and wonderful and allows us to thrive as human beings, our ability to be problem solvers. And so I think we could almost say that we want to put in place support systems that will help people who perhaps, are not able to be problem solvers, to help them to become better problem solvers, to bring them into the fold of being able to be problem solvers who can contribute their problem solving to the world. And yes, I'm sure there will always be cases of people in comas and people who will have certain diseases where there won't be any way for them to contribute. And one of the glories of having a society that has as much abundance as we've already created through the technological progress we've made in the 21st century is that we have so much abundance that we can care for those people. You can even think about how, if this were even a couple of thousand years ago, that people who couldn't fend for themselves, they would have been left and abandoned precisely because there just weren't enough resources to be able to care for such people. That one of the benefits of having a society that creates abundance is that there is enough abundance to care for the few true cases of people who wouldn't be able to care for themselves, but that ultimately we would want to have a system that would be geared toward, I would just even put it like being an adult. We don't want to be perpetual children, under the thumb of some paternalistic overlord. We want to all be able to rise to the level of being fully functional adults who make decisions for ourselves and build our own lives and figure out which relationships we want to pursue, who we want to collaborate with, and that's the goal, I would say. But there is in this model a way of thinking about combining both the social and the individual.
Yeah. And I like what you said about, Peter Diamandis talking about how bringing everybody online, we're bringing in all these other potential problem solvers. It's going to be 8 billion individuals, in the next generation that are all connected. But it's, going back to what we were talking about before about it's specifically because these people will be potentially connected to everybody else that will make them more able to be that kind of innovator or problem solver. because, you know, they're building on the ideas of everyone else that they now have access to, right?
Mhm.
So there's a historian of innovation named Stephen Johnson. He's written a bunch of books, and he talks about what he calls innovation hubs, where, you know, historically, like there would be, you know, major innovations will happen in specific fields in certain places because you know, of the network effects of, like, you know, well, somebody already like makes a major innovation in an area somewhere. So like, I think like one of the major examples he uses, you know, like the glass makers of like Florence or Venice or something in like the Renaissance or something. And because like one person figures out some new process to make glass, well, now he's attracting more people to him in that area who are working on the same problem and able to, you know, build on it more. Or look at, you know, like Walt Disney, you know, when he started his company, I just watched Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs for the first time since I was a kid the other night. And it's amazing. Like the history of Disney as a company is just kind of astonishing. But, you know, Walt
And
Disney.
the technological advancement that Snow White was
Oh,
for its day.
oh yeah, yeah. Like it's unbelievable some of the advances that he came up with, and like in everything that we have in the entertainment industry today, like all depends on those innovations that he made in terms of combining, you know, live action photography and animation and all of these things, which now like you can't even tell the difference anymore between like the CGI, photorealistic CGI animation and the live action photography. But and that was kind of like his vision, you know, like that he was going for from early on. And but, you know, part of the reason that he was able to make that vision, you know, he set us that industry on the path to making that vision become a reality, is because he attracted so many people and hired so many people who were also innovative thinkers in that field, to come work for him to do something as innovative as Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was at the time. So and you know, when Peter Diamandis talks about all of these people coming online, basically what he's talking about is like the internet is turning the entire globe into one giant innovation hub, where now anybody anywhere can connect with the ideas of anyone else anywhere else, and build, you know, even faster and further than was ever possible before. So those kind of innovation hubs are just no longer going to be like locally restricted to, you know, you have to work in Silicon Valley, you know, if you want to make major innovations in the computer industry like you maybe did 50 years ago when it was still young. But, you know, like, yeah, that's just one example. I mean, like it's really connecting everyone, and that's just going to accelerate the progress of creating that sort of abundant reality that we've been talking about. So I don't know, do you think that's a good place to wrap up?
I think so. I was going to say, I've not heard of Stephen Johnson, I think you said his name was. I'm going to have to check out this book, but I love this idea of the innovation hub. Maybe that's even how we'll start, you know, the next iteration of thinking about what is our better ethical model, and that it ought to include something like the innovation hub, which I think is precisely this, a group of people coming together, cooperating, trading, each of them being individualized problem solvers and creators, but recognizing that if they come together and trade and work together, that they can create something that benefits each of them and all of them much more so than anyone ever could on a desert island. What is the book? Do you remember off the top of your head?
He's got a whole bunch of books. I'm trying to remember the title of the specific one that I got the idea of the Innovation Hub from. Let me just Google him real quick here and I can tell you. Okay. Oh, so he actually had a PBS series based on one of his books as well called How We Got to Now. It was really good. But I think the one that I was thinking of was a book called Where Good Ideas Come From, The Natural History of Innovation. But he's written a whole bunch of other books, and several of them have been like bestsellers. So you might recognize some of the titles if you look at a list of his books.
I'm definitely going to check that out. And maybe, hopefully, people who are watching and listening, maybe they've already even read it. They're maybe way ahead of me. And hopefully, this is just a first start at thinking about how we build on the ethical philosophers who've come before us and the insights that we now have in biology and start to build a better ethical model.
Yeah.
Any last thoughts?
No, I thank you. It was an interesting conversation as always, Joia.
Yeah, thank you. And let's definitely plan to do this again sometime.
Sure. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in. If you'd like to join in the conversation, you can become a member for free and join our 1776 Forward community on locals.com. See you there.